The Germans had captured a seemingly ordinary Soviet girl and sent her to forced labor. Let her haul stones with the work crews, they figured. But they couldn't have suspected that soon. She would cause them such serious problems that German soldiers would wish they had never captured her. In 1942, near Voronezh, a battle drew to a close, leaving smoldering skeletons of war machines and a silence broken only by the crackle of burning wreckage. Amidst the destroyed tanks, German search parties found the wounded, collected war trophies, and interrogated prisoners. For tank crews, as a rule, a single fate awaited. They were not sent to camps. They were specialists too valuable, yet too dangerous, even without their machines. The Germans understood this and acted accordingly. Yevdokia Afanasyeva knew these rules well. She was a driver mechanic of a T-34 tank, one of the few women to have mastered this skill. She knew admitting her profession meant she would not live to see another dawn. Her concussion was real. An explosion near her machine had deafened her, knocking her unconscious for several minutes. But when consciousness returned and she saw German helmets around her, the decision was instant. She had to pretend, to forget everything, to become a nobody. The Germans saw a simple village girl caught in the crossfire. Dirty clothes, no identification papers, rambling speech. Everything pointed to her being a dazed, shell-shocked civilian. The oil stains on her clothes gave nothing away. With wreckage burning everywhere, she could have gotten soiled anywhere. The stench of burning also failed to betray her. After such a battle, everyone was steeped in the smell of smoke. The officer screening the prisoners didn't waste time on her. He simply gestured toward a truck where those destined for forced labor were herded. Yevdokia played her part flawlessly. She swayed, mumbled, and stared right through people. When pushed, she meekly walked where pointed. When shouted at, she trembled and cowered. When other prisoners spoke to her, she turned away and whispered something unintelligible. After several days, a convoy brought the group to a permanent camp, a rear echelon base with repair workshops. Here the Germans collected damaged military hardware, both their own and captured Soviet equipment. Tanks, trucks, artillery tractors, anything that could be serviced or stripped for parts. The work was manual labor, and the prisoners of war were perfect for it. As free labor, no one had qualms about using them for the heaviest, dirtiest tasks. Yevdokia was assigned to a team dismantling damaged machines, unscrewing and sorting salvageable components and hauling heavy parts. German master mechanics handled the skilled repairs. Prisoners served in support roles. There were guards, but security was not excessive. The camp was far from the front lines, and escapes were virtually unheard of. Besides, where could a shell-shocked woman who barely knew where she was possibly run? For the first few days, Yevdokia feigned complete detachment. She would stare at a wrench for 5 minutes as if seeing one for the first time, or stroke a tank's armor as if it were a village cow. Her German overseers were initially irritated, but soon shrugged it off, figuring she could do something as long as she stayed out of the way. But behind this mask of incompetence lay a razor-sharp mind. Yevdokia meticulously observed everything, memorizing the workshop layout, the guard change schedule, and the sentries' habits. She studied the types of machines, their damage, and the time needed to restore them. She listened to the German mechanics, pretending not to understand a word. Most importantly, she had gained access to their military hardware. German tanks she had previously only seen through a gun sight. Now, she could study them up close, understand their design, and memorize their weak spots. Each day, behind her simpleton guise, she learned more about the enemy's war machines. And with each passing day, an escape plan matured in her mind. Not on foot through the woods, where she would be caught the first day, nor in a truck, which would not get far without papers. Yevdokia Afanasieva was a tank driver, and she would escape the only way she knew how. Yes, you read that right. She intended to escape in a tank. The repair camp was in a small town, now a transit hub for damaged equipment, approximately 40 kilometers from the front line. This was far enough to be safe from any sudden breakthroughs, yet close enough for repaired machines to be swiftly returned to their units. The Germans had established a full-blown repair operation on the site. 3 large hangars, open yards for stripping down hopelessly damaged vehicles, warehouses for spare parts, a smithy, and a welding shop. Every morning, Yevdokia and the other prisoners were led out to work. The older guards and a few young soldiers, deemed unfit for the front on medical grounds, didn't stand on ceremony, but they didn't display excessive cruelty either. Their job was simply to ensure the workers didn't idle and didn't try to escape. Everything else was of little interest to them. Yevdokia quickly figured out the routine. Morning roll call, a reading of the list where she was listed simply as number 27, a woman with an unestablished identity. Then the column was marched to the hangars or the open yards and split into work details. Yevdokia invariably ended up where the tanks were being dismantled. The German foreman quickly noticed that this strange, silent woman was good with tools, even if she pretended not to understand their purpose. The first tank she was allowed to work on was a damaged Panzer III. The machine had taken a direct hit to the hull, but its running gear and engine remained intact. German technicians were dismantling the damaged armor plates, preparing to install new ones. Yevdokia was ordered to unscrew the bolts securing the internal equipment that was hindering the repairs. She worked slowly, constantly asking with gestures what exactly needed to be done, dropping tools and mixing up the wrenches. The German foreman, a portly man of about 50 with a perpetually red face, first tried to explain, but then he waved a dismissive hand and simply pointed. Unscrew this, remove that, move this over here. Yevdokia would nod obediently and carry out the orders. But all the while, her eyes were absorbing every detail of the tank's construction. Everything a professional tanker needed to know about an enemy machine to understand how to destroy it, or how to drive away in it. Yevdokia memorized the position of every lever and every pedal, mentally comparing it to the T-34 she had served on, noting the similarities and differences. After a week, she was moved to another section. Here, they were restoring a Panzer IV, a heavier machine with significantly reinforced armor. The tank had been brought in after an unsuccessful engagement. Its entire right side was riddled with shrapnel. The track was torn off, but the engine worked. The Germans decided the machine was worth restoring. Yevdokia was given the task of cleaning the interior of debris and damage. It was dirty, heavy work. She had to scrape out the remains of the upholstery, remove deformed mounting brackets, and prepare surfaces for welding. But it meant that she spent entire days inside the tank, studying its inner workings down to the smallest detail. Every bolt, every joint, every control system, it was all committed to memory. And every day, a plan was taking shape in her mind, a plan that seemed insane. But perhaps for that very reason, it had a chance of success. The repair camp was located in a small town that the war had turned into a transit point for damaged military hardware. The front line was about 40 kilometers away, far enough away to not worry about sudden breakthroughs, but close enough to quickly return restored machines to their units. The Germans had organized a veritable repair production line here. 3 large hangars, open yards for dismantling hopelessly damaged equipment, warehouses for spare parts, a forge, and a welding hall. Rows of barbed wire surrounded the area, although it lacked the atmosphere of a death camp. This was a place of work, where prisoners had value as free labor. The Germans needed their hands to repair expensive machines, so they were treated harshly, but not with the methodical cruelty that reigned in the actual concentration camps. Here, people died from exhaustion and disease, but not from deliberate extermination. It was a subtle but crucial difference, one that gave Yevdokia a chance of survival. Every morning, Yevdokia and the other prisoners were marched out to work. The older guards and a few young soldiers, deemed unfit for the front due to their health, didn't stand on ceremony, but they didn't show excessive cruelty either. Their job was to ensure the workers didn't idle and didn't try to escape. Everything else was of little interest to them. They were mostly veterans of the First World War, tired men who preferred a quiet post far from the front to a heroic death in the trenches. Some even showed a kind of compassion, though they never allowed themselves anything that could be mistaken for weakness. After all, they were Germans in an occupied country, surrounded by enemies, and any show of leniency could be used against them. Yevdokia had learned to read their moods, knowing when she could pause for a moment and when she had to work diligently. This ability to read people became another of her survival tools. The system was simple and predictable. In the morning, there was a roll call, a reading of the list, where Yevdokia figured simply as number 27, a woman of undetermined identity. The Germans attached no importance to establishing her true identity. What for? She was just another pair of hands to work, another body to be used until it collapsed from exhaustion. Then the column would be led to the hangars or open yards and divided into sections. Yevdokia invariably ended up where tanks were being dismantled. At first, this was by chance, but it soon became routine. The German foremen quickly noticed that this strange, silent woman handled tools well, even if she pretended not to understand their purpose. There was something natural in her movements, as if instinct told her how to handle metal and bolts. They did not dwell on it for long. After all, some civilians had experience with tractors and agricultural machinery. This explained her abilities without arousing any suspicion. Captivity had its own hierarchy and its own rules. There were prisoners who broke down mentally, lost their will to live, and died within weeks. There were others who tried to resist, to rebel, to protest, and perished under the guards' bullets. Then there were those who sought an easier path, collaborating with the enemy, informing on their comrades in hopes of an extra slice of bread or gentler treatment. Yevdokia belonged to a fourth category, the rarest and the most difficult to sustain. She was one of those who waited. They did not break down, nor did they rebel. They submitted, seemingly completely, yet on the inside, they preserved a spark of resistance, of a plan, of hope. It was psychologically draining, playing this role day after day, hour after hour, never letting the mask slip, never revealing one's true nature. But Yevdokia knew it was the only way. One moment of inattention, one word spoken in anger or exhaustion, and everything would be over. The repair workshops were a fascinating place, if you could detach yourself from the horror of the situation. It was a veritable factory where machines that were all but dead were brought back to life. The Germans approached this work with their characteristic precision and efficiency. Every tank was catalogued, assessed, and classified according to its degree of damage. Those that could be fixed quickly were directed for immediate overhaul and sent back to the front within days. Moderately damaged machines required weeks of work. The ones most battered by the war were stripped for parts, every salvaged component catalogued for use in repairing other vehicles. Nothing went to waste. The Germans could not afford any losses, especially in the year 1942, when the Russian winter and the fierce resistance of the Red Army began to take a toll on their resources. Every repaired tank was a valuable asset. Every recovered part could decide the outcome of a battle. Yevdokia observed this process with a growing understanding. She saw how the German engineers treated the captured Soviet tanks with respect, especially the T-34. She overheard their conversations, in which they admitted with grudging admiration that the Soviet design was simpler, more reliable, and easier to repair than their own complicated machines. Soviet tanks were designed for Russian conditions, for the frost and the mud, for situations where a qualified mechanic was a luxury. A German tank was a work of precision engineering that required specialized handling and meticulous maintenance. It was a difference in philosophy, a clash of worlds. And Yevdokia was beginning to understand that this difference could be exploited. If she could just get her hands on a Soviet machine, she would know how to start it. But first, she had to learn everything about the German tanks, for they were the ones that dominated the camp. The days blurred into a monotonous routine, but Yevdokia treated each one as another lesson. She worked on various types of panzers, gradually building a mental map of their construction in her head. She learned to distinguish the sounds of their engines and came to know the characteristic features of each model. She already knew that the Panzer III had lighter armor, but better maneuverability. The Panzer IV was heavier, slower, but more heavily armored. There were also the trophies, captured T-34 tanks and even a few heavy KVs, which the Germans were repairing with the intention of using them against their former owners. It was both ironic and cruel, yet it gave Yevdokia hope. If the Germans repaired a Soviet tank, she would know how to steal it. Every time she saw a KV or a T-34 being brought into the camp, her heart would race. This could be her chance. All she had to do was wait for the right moment. The German master craftsmen and technicians in the workshops were a curious bunch. Most were middle-aged or older civilians, specialists brought from Germany or recruited locally from among the Volksdeutsche. They weren't soldiers. They lacked the military mindset. They were craftsmen, men who loved their work and treated every repaired tank as a personal accomplishment. Some of them even began to treat Yevdokia with a certain condescension, the way a master treats a dog that has learned a few tricks. They would sometimes give her easier tasks, letting her rest in the shade of a hangar during the most sweltering hours. This wasn't kindness, but rather pragmatism. She knew that by making herself useful, she was increasing her chances of survival. And every day she stayed alive was another step closer to freedom. But the most valuable asset she acquired during those weeks was knowledge of the camp's security. Yevdokia watched for patterns, memorizing every detail. She knew that the changing of the guard took place at 5 in the morning and 7 in the evening. She knew that during the changeover, there was a 15-minute gap when both shifts were in the guardhouse at the same time, preparing for the handover. She knew which sections of the fence were most visible from the watchtowers and which were in blind spots. She knew where the gates were, how they were locked, who had the keys. She also knew that most of the tanks were parked in the open yards on the eastern edge of the camp, closest to the main gate. From there, it would be easiest to get onto the road leading toward the front. All this information gathered in her mind like pieces of a puzzle, waiting for the moment they could be assembled into a single, coherent escape plan. The first tank she was allowed near was a damaged Panzer III. The machine had taken a hit to the hull from a Soviet anti-tank shell, but its running gear and engine remained intact. It was a lucky break for the Germans and a priceless lesson for Yevdokia. The German technicians were dismantling the damaged armor plates, preparing to install new ones. Judokia was tasked with unscrewing the bolts of the internal fittings that were getting in the way of the repairs. She worked slowly, constantly asking with gestures what exactly needed to be done, dropping tools and mixing up wrenches. The German foreman, a portly man in his 50s with a perpetually red face and constantly sweaty palms, first tried to explain things, but soon waved his hand dismissively and simply pointed. Unscrew this, remove that, move this other thing. Yevdokia would nod obediently and carry out the orders, but all the while, her eyes were absorbing every detail of the German machine's construction. The Panzer III was a medium tank, designed primarily to combat other tanks. Yevdokia quickly noticed the differences between it and the Soviet T-34. The German tank was more complex, with more internal mechanisms and more precise systems. Its Maybach HL 120 TRM engine, a 12-cylinder liquid-cooled unit with about 265 horsepower, was an impressive but demanding piece of machinery. The gearbox, initially a 10-speed semi-automatic Variorex, replaced in later versions with a 6-speed manual, required delicate yet firm handling. Yevdokia watched as the German mechanics checked every component, oiling and adjusting. Everything had to work perfectly. Otherwise, the entire system would fail. This was the philosophy of German engineering. Perfection, but a fragile perfection. Soviet tanks were simpler, more resilient to rough treatment, designed for conditions where a mechanic might not be available for weeks. But it was precisely this complexity that gave Yevdokia an advantage. The German technicians spoke freely in her presence, convinced the injured woman did not understand a single word. They discussed problems with the transmission, the difficulties in finding suitable spare parts, and how long the repairs would take. Yevdokia absorbed every word, building a mental map of the German machine's weak points. She now knew that the main clutch in the Panzer III was located by the engine, and that the gearbox was at the front, connected to the engine by a long drive shaft running under the floor of the fighting compartment. She knew where the control levers were, how the braking system worked, and which pedals controlled the throttle, clutch, and brake. Every piece of information was more precious than gold. Every detail could mean the difference between life and death when she finally decided to make her escape. After a week, she was moved to another section. Here, they were restoring a Panzer IV, a heavier tank with significantly reinforced armor. The machine had arrived after a fierce battle. Its entire right side was riddled with shrapnel from Soviet artillery. The track was snapped. Several road wheels were destroyed. But the engine, the same Maybach HL 120, worked flawlessly. The Germans decided it was worth repairing. The Panzer IV was originally designed as an infantry support tank, armed with a short-barreled 75mm cannon for taking on fortifications. But the war changed priorities, and newer versions received longer barrels, capable of fighting other tanks. Judokia was given the task of cleaning the interior of debris and damage. The work was dirty and exhausting. She had to scrape out the remnants of upholstery, remove deformed mounting brackets, and prepare the surfaces for welding. But it meant she spent entire days inside the tank, studying its inner workings down to the smallest detail. The Panzer IV had a different internal layout than the Panzer III. The engine was offset to the right of the vehicle's axis, which resulted in an asymmetrical distribution of space. The driver had more room than the machine gunner. The gearbox, initially a 5-speed, but a 6-speed SSG 77 in later models, was also shifted to the right. This affected the way it handled. Judokia memorized every nuance. She knew that if she ever had to drive a German tank, these details could be crucial. It was not enough to know where the pedals and levers were. You had to understand how the machine responded, how it balanced, what its quirks were. Every tank had its own character, its own whims, and Judokija was systematically getting to know the personality of the German machines. Weeks turned into months. Judokija worked on dozens of tanks, both German and captured Soviet ones. She saw panzers of all types, from the light 2s to the heavy 4s. She watched how the German engineers treated captured T-34s with respect, albeit grudgingly. She heard their comments about the simplicity of the Soviet design, about the wide tracks perfect for the Russian mud, about the sloped armor that deflected shells more effectively than the thicker but vertical German plates. Some German officers even suggested that certain Soviet solutions should be copied. But German engineering was too proud, too convinced of its own superiority. They preferred to refine their own designs, adding ever thicker layers of armor and ever more powerful guns, not understanding that sometimes simplicity is a strength, not a weakness. Judokija understood this perfectly. Her T-34 could be fixed with a hammer and a curse. A German panzer required specialized tools and a skilled mechanic. Every evening, upon returning to the barracks, Yevdokia would replay in her mind everything she had learned that day. She couldn't take notes. She couldn't draw diagrams. Everything had to be committed to memory. Every detail, every connection, every mechanism. She developed a memorization technique, dividing the tank into sections in her mind, like rooms in a house. The driver's compartment with its levers and pedals. The fighting compartment with its ammunition and turret control systems. The engine compartment with its complex web of wires, pipes, and mechanisms. For each section, she created a mental image so vivid she could see it with her eyes closed. This ability to visualize became her superpower, a tool for survival and for preparing for what she intended to do. The other prisoners were dying inside, losing hope, becoming mere shadows. Yevdokia, however, was living more intensely than ever before. Because she knew that each day brought her closer to freedom. There were also moments of doubt. Nights when she lay on her hard bunk, listening to the quiet weeping of the other women, and wondered if her plan was not pure madness. Steal a tank? From a camp full of guards, and then drive 40 kilometers through occupied territory, teeming with German patrols and checkpoints. The chance of success seemed microscopic, but the alternative was death in the camp. Slow or fast, but inevitable. The Germans had no intention of letting the prisoners go. Those who were too weak to work simply vanished. No one asked questions. Everyone knew. Yevdokia had two options: try to escape and probably die, or stay and certainly die. The choice was obvious, and every day in the workshops gave her more skills, more knowledge, more of a chance. She just had to wait for the right moment, for the right machine. And that moment could not be planned. She had to be ready to seize the opportunity when it arose. One August morning, when the heat was already unbearable despite the early hour, a transport tractor entered the campgrounds, towing something that made Yevdokia's heart stop for a moment. It was a Soviet KV-1 heavy tank. The machine was horrifically damaged. Half the turret was torn off by a powerful explosion, the tracks were ripped apart, and the entire left side was riddled with holes like a sieve. But the hull was more or less intact. And most importantly, Yevdokia recognized its characteristic shape. The KV-1, the Klim Voroshilov, named in honor of the Soviet People's Commissar for Defense. 45 tons of steel and power, a legend from the beginning of the war. A tank that German soldiers feared more than anything else. Judokija had seen these machines in action before her capture. She knew what they were capable of. And now, one of them was lying here, in a German camp, awaiting repair or disassembly for parts. It was the kind of chance she hadn't even dared to dream of. German engineers stood around the tank, gesticulating and debating. Judokija worked nearby, feigning complete disinterest, but her ears were sharp. She could hear their conversation. The chief engineer, a tall German with gray hair and gold-rimmed glasses, was explaining the history of this particular tank to the younger technicians. It had been knocked out during the Battle of Rzhev, most likely by an 88mm Flak 18 anti-aircraft gun, the only weapon that could reliably pierce the KV's armor. The crew had been killed, and the tank was too damaged to be evacuated. So the Germans had towed it for several hundred kilometers to this camp. Now a decision had to be made: repair it or scrap it. A younger engineer argued for scrapping it. Too much work, too many parts to replace. The older one shook his head. The KV-1 was a valuable trophy. If they could get it running, it could serve as a training tank, or perhaps even return to the fight under German colors. Such things had been known to happen. Judokija listened, praying silently. Let them decide to repair it. Let them fix this machine. Because if they did, she was going to steal it. The KV-1 was a Soviet design. She knew every inch of that tank, even if she had never personally driven one. The V2K engine, a 12-cylinder diesel with 600 horsepower. Simple, reliable, designed for Russian conditions. The gearbox was identical to the one in the T-34, a 5-speed, easy to operate. The controls were familiar too, and most importantly, the armor. 75mm at the front, impenetrable to most German weaponry. On the way to the front lines, that armor could save her life. No German tank had that kind of protection. It was the perfect escape vehicle. Heavy, slow, but almost indestructible. If the Germans repaired it, Judokija would take it and drive home. The discussion dragged on for most of the day. More officers arrived, inspecting the tank, assessing the damage. Finally, late in the afternoon, the decision was made. Repair. The KV-1 was too valuable a prize to be wasted. Work would begin the next morning. Yevdokia barely slept that night. She lay on her bunk, eyes wide open in the darkness of the barracks, planning every single detail. She knew the repairs would take weeks, perhaps months. The KV-1 was severely damaged. The turret would have to be replaced, the engine repaired, new tracks fitted, and every system inspected. This would buy her time to observe, to memorize every detail of the repairs, to choose the perfect moment. But she had to be cautious. If she showed too much interest, she might arouse suspicion. She had to maintain her guise as an injured simpleton right up to the very end. Until the moment she climbed into that tank and drove towards freedom. The following morning, Yevdokia was assigned to the team working on the KV-1. This was no coincidence. The German master mechanics had grown accustomed to her presence around the tanks and decided she could be useful for simple tasks. The first few weeks of work focused on dismantling the destroyed components. The ruined turret was cut away with gas torches and lifted off by a crane. It was a surreal sight. The massive steel structure suspended in midair, then slowly lowered to the ground. Yevdokia helped clear the hull of the turret's remnants, hauling away pieces of mangled metal and unscrewing rusted bolts. Every hour spent inside the hull was a lesson. She committed to memory the location of every component, every wire, every mechanism. Here was the driver's station, there the assistant driver mechanics. Here were the fuel tanks, over there the ammunition racks. A three-dimensional map was forming in her mind. The Germans had decided to use a turret from another wrecked KV-1, which had been brought in from a different camp. That turret was in better condition, though it also required repairs. The installation took several days and was a fascinating process. Yevdokia watched as the German engineers precisely positioned the turret, checked its traverse mechanism, and tested the systems. The KV-1 turret was either cast or welded depending on the model. This particular one was cast, with armor 95 millimeters thick. Inside, there was room for 3 men: the commander, gunner, and loader. But Yevdokia was planning to escape alone. She didn't need a crew. She needed only an engine, tracks, and armor. The rest was secondary. She could drive the tank without a turret crew. It would be more difficult, but it was possible. The most challenging part of the entire repair was the engine. The Germans had to completely dismantle it, clean it, and replace the damaged parts. The V2K engine was a solid piece of engineering, but after the explosion that had wrecked the tank, many of its components were warped. Yevdokia helped clean the parts and move the heavy components. She watched the German mechanics, who, it had to be said, worked with professionalism and a certain respect for Soviet engineering. She heard their comments. Simple design, but effective. Less complicated than a Maybach, but more resistant to rough handling. This was true. Soviet engines were designed for conditions where access to a workshop might be unavailable for months. A German engine required precision servicing. A Soviet engine needed only fuel and basic maintenance. After weeks of labor, the engine was reassembled, installed in the engine compartment, and connected to the cooling system and transmission. In September, after more than 6 weeks of work, the moment of the first startup arrived. Yevdokia stood to one side, feigning indifference, but her heart was hammering in her chest. A German mechanic climbed into the driver's seat, checked all the gauges, and adjusted the levers. He turned the ignition. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the engine coughed, sputtered, and with a deafening roar, came roaring back to life. Black smoke shot from the exhaust pipe. The engine ran erratically for a few seconds, then stabilized, settling into a deep, powerful bass rumble. The Germans smiled, clapping one another on the back. It was a small victory. Now it was time to test the tracks and the running gear. The new tracks, 700 millimeters wide, were fitted using a crane and over a dozen men. Each track was composed of dozens of steel links connected by pins. The work was exhausting, but Yevdokia took part, learning in the process how to remove and refit the tracks. This knowledge could prove useful if something went wrong during her escape. By the end of September, the KV-1 was practically ready. The Germans conducted a series of tests within the campgrounds. The tank drove back and forth across the yard, turning and reversing as every system was checked. Yevdokia watched with apparent indifference, but in reality, she was studying every movement, every sound. She learned the engine's characteristic roar upon acceleration, the screech of the tracks during a turn, the vibration of the hull in motion. This tank was becoming a part of her, even before she had climbed inside to drive it. The Germans were satisfied. The tank was operational. Now it was waiting for transport to some training unit, or perhaps back to the front as a trophy. But before transport, it had to undergo a final inspection and get a full tank of fuel. And it was this very moment that Yevdokia chose as her time. When the tank was ready, refueled, inspected, and waiting for transport, that would be her only chance. She observed the patterns. In the evening, after 1900 hours, most of the camp staff finished their work. The guards changed at 2000 hours. During that half an hour, attention was scattered. The tank stood in an open yard near the main gate. If she could manage to get inside, start the engine, and get moving before anyone reacted, she would have the upper hand. The KV-1 wasn't fast, a maximum of 35 kilometers per hour on the road. But its armor made it nearly unstoppable. The guards had rifles, maybe a machine gun. That wasn't enough. The anti-tank guns were far away. By the time they could prepare them, she would be out of range. It was a crazy plan, but it was the only plan she had. And every day, looking at the KV-1 standing ready in the yard, she felt the moment drawing inevitably closer. She just had to choose the right night. A night when everything would fall into place. And then she would go. She would go home or die trying. But she would not remain in this captivity a day longer than necessary. The night was moonless, the sky covered with a thick layer of clouds promising rain. It was a sign. Yevdokia had been waiting for a night like this for weeks. Ever since the KV-1 had been repaired and parked in the open yard, ready for transport. During the evening roll call, she counted the minutes, feigning indifference, while her heart pounded like a hammer. She returned to the barracks with the other prisoners and lay down on her bunk, fully clothed. She waited. Around her, the women were falling asleep, exhausted from the day's hard labor. Yevdokia lay motionless, counting the seconds, the minutes, the hours. At 19:30 hours, she quietly slid off her bunk. No one noticed. Or if they did, they didn't react. In the barracks, everyone lived in their own private agony, each focused on surviving another day. No one had the strength to care about what another person was doing. Yevdokia slipped out through the back door of the barracks, which wasn't locked. After all, where would the prisoners run to in the middle of the night? She moved along the wall, sticking to the shadows. There were guards, but they were lax. The camp had been operating for months without a single serious escape attempt. The guards stood by the gate, smoking cigarettes, talking. Yevdokia knew their routine. The changing of the guard was in 15 minutes. That was her window of opportunity. She slipped through a side passage between the hangars, drawing closer to the open yard where the KV-1 stood. In the darkness, the tank looked like a hulking mountain, massive and menacing. The Germans had placed their markings on it, a black cross on the turret, identification numbers. But that didn't change the fact that it was a Soviet tank, her tank. Yevdokia approached the hull, her heart in her throat. She touched the cold steel. It was real. This was really happening. She climbed onto the hull, using the handholds she had memorized during weeks of repairs. Her hands were shaking, but her movements were sure. She opened the driver's hatch. It was unlocked. The German technicians never expected a theft in the middle of the night in their own camp. She slid inside, closing the hatch above her. The darkness was absolute. The smell of oil, metal, and rubber filled her nostrils. A familiar scent. The smell of home. Yevdokia settled into the driver's seat, her hands automatically finding the pedals, levers, and switches. Everything was where it should be. She placed her hand on the ignition switch. One turn and the engine would roar to life. One turn and there would be no going back. She took a deep breath. She thought of those who had died, of her comrades in arms, of her homeland, of everything she had lost. She turned the key. The V2K engine coughed, sputtered, and with a deafening roar, it came to life. The sound was immense, shattering the camp's nighttime silence like an air raid siren. Yevdokia engaged first gear and released the clutch. The tank lurched and moved forward. The tracks thundered on the concrete yard. Shouts came from outside. The Germans reacted instantly. Searchlight beams flashed, illuminating the KV-1 like a star on a stage. Yevdokia ignored it. She pointed the tank straight toward the main gate. She shifted into second gear. The tank accelerated, gathering momentum. 45 tons of steel hurtled across the yard. The guards at the gate stood for a second in shock. Then they scattered. One of them raised his rifle and fired. The bullets hammered against the armor like rain on a tin roof. Utterly harmless. The gate was closed, but it was a structure of wood and barbed wire designed to stop people, not tanks. The KV-1 hit it at full speed. The wood exploded. The barbed wire tore apart like thread. The tank passed through the gate as if it wasn't there, driving out onto the road leading away from the camp. Yevdokia turned east. She knew exactly which way to go. She had studied the map in her mind for months. 40 kilometers east to the front line, 40 kilometers through occupied territory, 40 kilometers between slavery and freedom. She shifted into third gear. The tank shuddered and thundered, but it kept going. In the rear vision slits, she could see the camp's lights. She heard the sirens. The Germans were scrambling a pursuit, but they needed time to ready their vehicles, to mobilize their men. And she had a head start. The road was unpaved, full of holes and ruts. The KV-1 handled it without a problem. Its wide tracks distributed the weight, and the tank rolled over the uneven ground like a ship on the waves. Yevdokia drove by instinct, her hands and feet working automatically, correcting her course, changing gears, maintaining maximum speed. The rain began to fall, lightly at first, then with growing intensity. This was good. The rain would conceal her, hampering the pursuit. But it also made driving more difficult. The vision slits fogged up, and visibility dropped to almost zero. Yevdokia had to open the hatch every few moments to check her direction, risking being spotted. But there was no choice. Driving blind could end with the tank overturned in a ditch. After 20 minutes of driving, she heard the sound of engines behind her. Motorcycles, light German vehicles, faster than her tank. They had caught up. Through the rear vision slit, she saw the lights of their headlamps approaching fast. Then came the gunshots. Bullets hammered against the rear armor. Yevdokia ignored them. Rifles couldn't penetrate the KV's armor. But she knew this was only the first wave. Heavier vehicles would follow the motorcycles, maybe even other tanks. She had to extend her lead. She slammed the accelerator to the floor. The engine roared in protest, but the tank picked up speed. 35 kilometers per hour. That was the maximum on this road. Yevdokia held a steady course eastward, knowing that every minute brought her closer to safety. Or to a trap. The Germans could have set up a roadblock ahead of her. It was a race against time. Dawn found her 20 kilometers from the camp. The rain had stopped and the sky was brightening. This was bad. In the light of day, she was an easier target. But on the other hand, she could see where she was going much better. The road continued eastward, through fields and small villages. In one of the villages, Yevdokia encountered a German supply convoy. 5 trucks heading in the opposite direction. When they saw the tank, they stopped. The German soldiers got out, waving their arms. They thought it was one of their own tanks. They could see the German markings. But something wasn't right. The tank was alone, without an escort. The tank was moving too fast. Before they could understand what was happening, Yevdokia was upon them. She chose her moment perfectly. She swerved sharply, the tracks screeching on the asphalt road. The KV-1 slammed its side into the first truck, flipping it over like a toy. The Germans scattered, shouting. One raised a Panzerfaust but didn't have time to fire. The tank thundered past, leaving chaos and dust in its wake. But now the Germans knew exactly where she was. The convoy's radio had surely sent out an alert. Yevdokia knew her time was running out. The next 10 kilometers would be critical. This was the area where the front lines were closest, where the concentration of German forces was at its highest. She had to get through this narrow corridor before the Germans could organize a serious defense. But luck was on her side. Or maybe not luck, maybe the chaos of war. The Germans had bigger problems than a single fleeing tank. The front was fluid, units were regrouping, and communications were a mess. Yevdokia pushed on, making the most of every minute, every kilometer. The fuel gauge showed half a tank. Enough. It had to be enough. At 10 in the morning, after 8 hours of driving, she saw it. A pine forest. Dense, dark. By her calculations, this was now the front line area. Somewhere in that forest, there should be the line of contact. Yevdokia steered the tank between the trees, slowing down. She drove cautiously now, aware she could run into mines, outposts, anything. Suddenly, a shot flashed from the left. The shell struck the left track. The tank lurched and came to a halt. Yevdokia froze. A broken track. She couldn't go any further. For a moment, panic seized her mind. Then she heard voices. Russian voices. She carefully opened the hatch and peered out. 3 men in filthy uniforms emerged from the woods. Partisans. A bearded face, suspicious eyes. Rifles aimed right at her. Yevdokia raised her hands. "Friendly," she shouted. "I'm a Soviet tanker. I've escaped from captivity." The partisans stared at her in disbelief. A woman, in a German tank, with German markings. It looked like a provocation. But Yevdokia told her story. Quickly, feverishly, begging them to believe her. She told them about her capture, about faking an injury, about the months in the repair camp, about stealing the KV-1. The partisan commander, a man with a hard face and cold eyes, listened in silence. Finally, he nodded. "We'll see," he said. "If you're lying, you'll regret it. If you're telling the truth, we'll help you get to your people." It wasn't a promise of safety, but it was hope. And after 3 months in captivity, hope was enough. The partisans helped her get out of the woods. The tank was left there, immobilized, its track broken. There was no point in trying to fix it without the right equipment. But the partisans had a tractor and a long rope. For the rest of the day, they towed the KV-1 along the forest paths, hiding it under branches, moving it slowly eastward. The partisan commander, who introduced himself as Stepan, was a cautious man. He didn't trust Yevdokia. That was obvious. The story sounded too incredible. A female tank driver? 3 months in captivity? A stolen tank? In wartime, such stories were told by provocateurs, German spies trying to infiltrate Soviet forces. Stepan knew this. That's why he kept his distance, though he didn't refuse to help. Yevdokia understood. In his place, she would have done the same. On the first night after their meeting, the partisans managed to get several dozen liters of diesel fuel, siphoned from a torched German truck their unit had taken out the day before. 40 liters. Not much, but enough to refuel the KV-1 and cover the last stretch of the journey. On the morning of the second day, a partisan mechanic, a young lad with a surprising knowledge of tanks, helped Yevdokia repair the track. The fix was makeshift, linking the treads with wire and bolts, but it was good enough for a dozen or so kilometers of driving. Yevdokia started the engine. The distinctive roar of the V2K echoed through the forest. The partisans unhooked the tractor. The KV-1 was moving on its own again. It was a feeling of triumph. Despite everything, despite the chaos and fear, she had made it. She was almost home. They crossed the front line before dawn on the third day. The partisans led Yevdokia to a sector held by a rifle division. They approached the forward trenches and gave the prearranged signal. A sentry rose from the trench, aimed his rifle, and demanded the password. Stepan gave the countersign. The sentry waved them forward. Yevdokia drove the tank out of the forest and into the open. Dawn was just breaking, the sky lightening in the east. Soviet soldiers in the trenches leaped out, seeing the heavy tank. Someone shouted an alarm. They thought it was an enemy attack. But then they spotted the red star on the turret, though it was faded and barely visible, and they lowered their weapons. A young lieutenant with a weary face and a threadbare field blouse ran up to the tank. Yevdokia opened the hatchback and leaned out. The lieutenant stopped, raising his eyebrows in astonishment at seeing a woman. A rapid exchange followed. Yevdokia introduced herself and explained the tank's origins. The lieutenant listened in disbelief, but ordered her and the partisans escorted to divisional headquarters, leaving the tank under guard. The divisional headquarters was in a surviving village school, 5 kilometers from the front line. Yevdokia and the partisans were brought there at 8 in the morning. The duty officer heard their brief report, furrowed his brow, and told them to wait. They waited for over an hour. Then she was summoned to the chief of staff, a colonel with a stern face and numerous decorations on his faded service tunic. The colonel listened to Yevdokia's story in silence, never interrupting, just nodding from time to time. When she finished, he asked about the camp's exact location, the number of guards, and the equipment being repaired there. Yevdokia answered clearly, providing specific numbers and landmarks. The colonel then dismissed the partisans and remained alone with her. He was blunt. Her story was unbelievable. A female tank driver, 3 months in captivity, the pretense, the escape in an enemy machine. It could be true or a well-fabricated cover story. Yevdokia replied calmly that the tank was on their positions and could be inspected. The colonel nodded, saying the tank would be checked, but so would she. He explained the procedure. 3 months in captivity required a thorough check, including interrogations by the special department, clarification of all details, and verification of facts. These were the rules for everyone returning from captivity. If everything was confirmed, she would return to service. If not, there would be consequences. Yevdokia declared she was ready for any verification, as she had nothing to hide. The colonel summoned the duty officer and ordered her taken to a separate room with a guard posted. This was not an arrest, just isolation until the circumstances were clarified. Standard procedure for those returning from behind enemy lines. Yevdokia spent the next week in a small room at the divisional headquarters. She was interrogated almost daily by special department officers, asking the same questions repeatedly, trying to catch her in a contradiction. Where had she served, and with whom? When had she been captured, and how, exactly? What was she doing in the camp? Whom had she seen? What did the Germans talk about? Why hadn't she tried to escape sooner? Yevdokia answered calmly and in detail, listing commanders' names, unit numbers, and battle dates. She told them about the camp, repair workshops, and German mechanics. She described feigning injury, studying the machinery, and waiting for the right moment to escape. She didn't embellish or invent heroic details. She simply told it like it was. The officers checked her every word, sending inquiries to archives and searching for documents about her service before capture. They interrogated Stepan's partisans to corroborate her story. They inspected the tank, looking for evidence to confirm or debunk her escape story. The tank confirmed everything. German serial numbers on spare parts, signs of recent repairs, and the nature of the damage. It all matched her account, Moreover, military engineers examined the machine and declared it fully combat ready. The engine ran perfectly, the transmission needed no repairs, and the running gear was in good order. The Germans had indeed restored the tank, and Yevdokia had indeed stolen it. After 10 days, the verification was over. The colonel summoned Yevdokia again, this time without guards, and relayed the findings. Her story was completely confirmed. Service records found, partisans corroborating her escape from the encirclement, the tank matching her description. There were no more reservations about her. Furthermore, Divisional Command was recommending her for a decoration. Stealing an enemy tank and delivering it to Soviet territory was a commendable feat. Yevdokia replied she simply wanted to return to service, to sit behind the levers again and fight. For the first time since they had met, the colonel smiled. He informed her a new tank battalion was being formed that needed experienced driver mechanics like her. She would be sent to a training center for a short refresher course, then assigned to a crew. 2 weeks later, Yevdokia was at the Armored Training Center. A month later, she was assigned to the crew of a new T-34. Her crew commander, Lieutenant Nestorov, 23 years old, twice wounded, with combat experience since the summer of 1942, met her without surprise. Nestorov had heard about the female tanker who escaped captivity in a captured tank. When he asked if she was ready, Yevdokia confirmed she was. The next day, her crew headed for the front, and Yevdokia Afanasieva returned to the ranks. Her escape story spread throughout the units, embellished with new details and becoming a legend. But she herself never liked to talk about it. For her, it was simply a job, hard, dangerous, but necessary. As a tanker, her place was behind the levers of her war machine as long as the war raged on. The KV-1 she brought back from captivity was transferred to a training unit, where it was used to train young tankers on the vehicle's design and tell the story of its return. The tank served until the war's very end, outliving many of its pupils. It became a symbol that even in captivity, a Soviet soldier remains a soldier, biding their time for the right moment to strike. Yevdokia Afanasieva fought through the entire war to Berlin. She was wounded 3 times and received 2 orders of the Red Star and a medal for courage. But for her, the greatest reward was something else entirely. That she had not broken in captivity, surrendered, or accepted her fate, but had merely pretended, waited, studied her enemy, and then struck back with their own weapon. That was the true victory. A small personal victory, but no less important. A victory of will over circumstances, mind over might, of a person who refuses to be defeated over those who had written them off as broken. I want to express my immense gratitude to those of you who have watched this video to the end. You are the best viewers. Write your names in the comments below. Don't forget to give a thumbs up, subscribe, and leave a comment. It's very important. Goodbye.